Okay, Mark, it looks like we are live. This is an incredibly momentous occasion. Not that we should focus on digits or anniversaries. It doesn't feel terribly scientific, but it does feel like a bit of a milestone for a young space rocks proposition that is, I guess, boldly going, certainly. Uplink 10. It's a big deal.
It's crazy. I was just looking through some emails a few weeks ago and where we thought, how can we do this? Who can we ask? I mean, of course, in some sense, the whole coronavirus period has been incredibly stretched out for many of us. Hours pass in weeks and weeks pass in hours, as people say. But here we are, number 10. And just some fantastic guests behind us that we've shared with over the last few weeks. And as you and I know, but we're not letting on yet, some fantastic guests in the near future as well. So yeah, this is a real milestone tonight.
Yeah, indeed. It feels pretty good, Mark. And what's especially cool, I think, is that we've covered just such a broad range of topics. Not just space science, but I guess just in keeping with the whole proposition of space rocks. The art, culture, music that it also inspires, which is such a big deal. But yeah, we have, I don't think, been remiss because it's just such a young proposition, but there is one area of music and self-expression that I think we haven't overlooked, but we haven't yet quite walked up to, and I guess that's what our guests tonight are. I think here to correct, certainly.
Yeah. So occasionally we've talked to people and I've invited them to be involved in space rocks and say, well, but I'm not a rock musician, and they sort of tend to fit a little bit, or haven't been. We haven't told them that it's a multiple meaning thing. It's space rocks as in asteroids flying through space. It's space rocks, perhaps as in rock and roll, but also space is a thing that rocks. But yeah, this evening, we're guests this evening. So we have on two people I've worked with in the last year or so in completely different musical spheres. So firstly, Kate Moore is a contemporary classical composer. She's Australian, but is based here in the Netherlands, and she's serious, kind of serious contemporary classical stuff. So she's very used to performing in big halls like the one I have here in my backdrop this evening. This one is the National Radio Symphony Orchestra in Poland, in Katowice, where you and I were lucky enough to visit at the end of last year. But she's worked on various things to do with space. Her father, and I hope she'll describe that, her father is actually in the space business, which I didn't know before I met her. And that's inspired some of her works that she's done, which she'll talk about. And then she got in contact with me, and we working with a band in the UK called Icebreker, contemporary classical band, commissioned a piece of work linked to space and European Space Agency, and we'll get into more detail about that later on. And then another other guest is Jesse Passenier, who is Dutch, lives here in the Netherlands, and he and I worked together on another project which was jazz. So he's a composer, a conductor, an instrumentalist, and we did this amazing show, amazing in so many ways, with the WDR Big Band, jazz band, kind of the German equivalent of BBC, with a big audience there in Cologne. He had composed some special music, which he'll talk about, for that, linked again to ISA. And I was in the interesting situation of having to give a talk in German for half an hour on a big stage with 2,000 people watching. So it was a very interesting evening all around. But I did what I could do, but yes, I carried the day. He composed pieces for this big band, jazz band, but also conducted on the evening. So yeah, really looking forward to seeing this evening.
Indeed, it's a lot to think about and a lot to take in. And I've got to be honest, it wasn't too long ago I was having a wonderful chat with one of our friends, Stuart Clark, who reminded me, and this is unbelievable for me to have forgotten. The first experience that I had of, I guess, space and big music, big overtures, it wasn't actually 2001. It was the opening crawl of Star Wars, but I guess you forget that because it's this big grand space opera. Just what a powerful moment that is, not for the visual, but for the sound as well. And I guess that's the kind of thing we're going to talk to Jesse and to Kate about just now. So without further ado, let's bring them in from the waiting room where they've been patiently sitting around. Okay, there we are. We have visual, and hopefully we have audio as well. Jesse and Kate, can you hear us? Are you receiving?
Yes.
Yes, all good.
Good evening, both.
Good evening.
Yeah.
How are you?
Well,
well, I'm in a symphony hall. I don't know about you. You're just in a room somewhere.
Great acoustics, though.
and I'm an
Start singing. I shall sing in a moment. Exactly. You'll regret saying that.
Well, welcome to the program. Actually, Mark and I were just kind of ruminating, and it's right too, isn't it? That sometimes people think because of the name Space Rocks, that we don't embrace all forms of expression or indeed all forms of music as well. And inevitably, I started talking about Star Wars because that was my first experience of a big composition. But it wasn't just about the music. It was the fusion of sight and sound. It was the visual of space combined with the, I guess, just this music that just passed right through me. What was yours? Where did it all begin for you? Kate, how about you?
Oh, my earliest, when music grabbed me. I have to turn mail off. I realized I forgot to turn mail off. My first obsession, there were three things that I was completely obsessed by. That was Robin Hood. There was Robin Hood in the early 80s with clannad music, the music of clannad. I listened to it so much as a 3-year-old that that I can still sing the whole album. And I absolutely loved Robin Hood so much that I drew a sort of fresco of the whole story, which is like 1 kilometer long on dot matrix paper.
Tell us, you still have it, right? You still have it.
Yes, I do still have it. Yes. I even brought it back to the Netherlands with me from Australia, so it's packed away safely. The other big thing, also when I was around that same time, was an archaeological program with the archaeologist Michael Wood about Troy, and sort of I think it was called Searching for Troy or something, and it was all about the Trojan horse, and I was completely obsessed with the Trojan horse. It was this amazing thing where you could be inside a horse and no one knew about it, then suddenly jump out and surprise everybody. But also the music was amazing for this show. So they would show the artifacts, and the artifacts would sort of spin, and there was a black background, and then it had this amazing music, which I used to know. I did know the composer, and I've momentarily forgotten, but he's the brother of another famous composer. It'll come to me. But yeah, it was really it was sort of all analog synth stuff, and that was the stuff that I really loved as a 4-year-old.
And I did
to get back to that, Kate.
Indeed. But it's interesting how you talk about it's actually TV was your first real exposure, the first time that you connected, which I think is probably a more common experience than I probably realized. But when I think about it, some of the biggest things for me really came from that. But you don't always realize it at the time. How about yourself, Jesse?
Oh, well, in my case, to be honest, music captured me extremely early on, and because I was, I grew up in a musical house, so my mother was teaching singing lessons. I would be crawling around under the feet of the students. It would be rather dangerous at times, and so that was, to be honest, my first musical experience is all this kind of homeschooling situation that my mother had going. If I jump quite far away from that, then at 16 years old, there was a very big moment for me where I ran into, and you're gonna like this because it's space related. It's a piece called Pluto and Beyond, and it's by a Danish composer, Jens Winter. He's also a trumpeter, and for this composition, he also plays the solo role himself, and it's with the Metropole Orchestra and him playing trumpet, and it is like a 3-movement piece that unifies classical and jazz in a great way. To me, it was like, what is this, you know? And it just overwhelmed me, and I was like, okay, I have to figure out how that works, you know. So that was, you know, and it remained important for me until this day.
Wow. I mean, were you playing music at the time? I mean, you know, you've been exposed to so much, but what was your
Yeah,
instrument?
yeah, it's funny. I didn't have quite the patience when I was very young for the piano, so that started a bit later. But at you know, at 5 years old, I started singing with my mom. And then at 10 years old, I started drumming, and then at 12 years old, I started to figure out the piano finally, and then the vibraphone added, and I started to collect all kinds of instruments, playing saxophone, electric bass. I had a guitar lying around. You know, it was a total mess, and I couldn't pick. So that's why I became a composer, you know.
So how did that then convert for both of you? I mean, people ask me, did you all, my kids, they asked me earlier this week, right? They're in the late teens, thinking about what they might want to do in life. They're studying and so on, but they haven't quite crystallized yet what they want to do. And they have a father who, they say, well, you wanted to be an astronomer ever since you were a kid. So was that your destiny in a sense? Did you know that that's what you wanted to do? Or were there sort of, you know, kinks where you went one way and went the other and ended up where you are now?
Jump for it, Kate. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Oh, sure. Yeah, well, it took many twists and turns, I guess. And actually, when I was very young, I wanted to be an astronomer as well, and also an archaeologist. They were the two things that I loved. And somehow, but through sound and music, that was where the love was actually. Like somehow connecting with either things hidden under the ground or things in the sky. Somehow music was the thing to reach both. That was always my sort of expression, and like the way I sort of found a way to kind of make a story or make things make sense, really from an early age. So like I make up stories by playing the piano, and yeah, somehow it all sort of wove in together. I never really considered that I was good enough to be a composer per se. I mean, I was always around people who, like, I don't know, with music, you have these young people like at the age of 5 or 6 that can already play like Mozart violin concertos and stuff. That's not me. but my friends were like that. So I had music lessons, and so I never really considered myself to be a musician as such, but I just really loved being creative and making things up, and making art, and making, actually it's about making stories or sort of connecting with, I think it is like the way where I grew up and my connection with like yeah, really I mean in sort of like in Oxfordshire in the country, in like this place sort of a medieval village where there was a lot of archaeology hidden in the ground, and you could also get this incredible landscape. That's really where it began, and that's where the sort of storytelling through music began for me as well. So I guess like as I go through life, I sort of follow these obsessions, and they just sort of lead me in this direction. And it seems to be that composition, the creative form of composition, was the thing that like drew my concentration in the most. And perhaps also my environment was sort of conducive to that as well. So I had a lot of encouragement from the people around me.
I just wanted to pick up very quickly on that thing of, you know, I'm British and grew up in rural England as well. And I remember one of the sort of formative things in my life, I didn't become an archaeologist, but it would sound very similar, was that from our primary school, our teacher took us to a place in the little village we lived in West Sussex. And there was the road we lived on was incredibly straight and long. And at some point it actually bent to the left. And it had been surveyed in the 1950s, and had discovered that it was part of a network of Roman roads, because it was long and straight. And then the teacher took us into the field just beyond the point where it bent, and a bunch of kids dug up, and there's a completely intact Roman road underneath the farmer's ground. And I was inspired by that as well. Same thing, right? This ability to dig back into the past, to touch another culture, to touch another world almost. I didn't become an archaeologist, but it stimulated me. And so it came down to that teacher enormously who understood the power of that. It wasn't about doing anything other than being able to unlock the world. I've tried to go back. The farm let anybody dig it up since the 1960s. So I'm trying to persuade the local archaeological people that we should be allowed to go back and dig it up one more time, but we'll see. It's an ambition.
Yeah,
but
sure.
I wanted to pick up on one thing there before we jump to Jesse. So you said you were interested in astronomy from an early age. And when I introduced you, I pointed out that your dad is in the space business. So
Yes.
maybe you should say a little bit about that, because that of course has informed one of your recent works as well.
Yeah, definitely so. Yeah, I mean, I guess well, I'm very close to my dad in that way. I mean, he's worked on a number of projects that have kind of shaped our life. We were in the UK for that reason. Being an Australian family, he worked at the Institute of Hydrology, and some of my earliest memories are in the Amazon rainforest, where he was, where we were sort of residing at a scientist research center in the middle of the forest where his research was, and then later until now, his research and his station is in sort of laser ranging systems, in particular with regards to satellites and space junk, space debris. Yeah, I mean, I think he certainly inspired me a lot somehow. I mean, and I'm just like a kid that tags along with dad. It wasn't that he kind of gave me special attention or anything. He was just a dad and I was a kid. But definitely these sort of these encounters and with these extraordinary places really influenced me very, very strongly.
So I think we'll come back to space junk a little bit later on, because that's a recent work, and exactly because it's a topic that we want to talk about in some shows anyway, you know, as the real phenomenon, and your dad's involved in that. But yes, so did you, I mean, you were programmed by your mum, you're going to become a musician, right? That's it from the get-go.
Well, the funny part is that my family always used to think that my brother would become the musician and I wouldn't. So I don't know what, it's interesting. It didn't pick up right away. It was kind of gradual once my teens started, that it became, you know, once I discovered the piano at 12, it went hand in hand with really discovering harmony and wanting to write pieces. I don't know, that was almost the same to me, you know, discovering music and just, so I was just discovering everything and trying to write things down. And that became very important. But there was a little break though, because at the age of like 17, I discovered martial arts, and suddenly I was very gripped by that. It was like, oh, what is all this? And it was very much about finding yourself, and I thought that was very interesting and relevant. So I really went quite far with that until actually. I after graduating from high school, I decided to go for a long apprenticeship program in the United States, in Texas. So I was there for 7.5 months, training intensively and discovering so much actually about myself. And then I have to say though that I came in there with the feeling that I would do that temporarily. I didn't think already at the time, I already thought like, probably I'll get back to music after this. So it was very interesting. But this is what happened. And I have to say that the input that I got from that, because it was very like, you know, looking at your personal own psychology and really digging into yourself and your fears and everything. It was very confronting, and I learned so much that I have enough for the rest of my life. So I hardly would need to keep that up, you know. And the other part of why I chose to get back to music was I for me, this martial arts world was a little bit too excluded from life. So I felt it was too much an exercise ground taken away, you know, taken out of life. So I needed to, I felt this draw like, no, I want to be more actively involved in society, and that's what music does also greatly. So yeah, that's really what drew me back to music. So after this, I started to study music, and that path was very strong and clear after that.
Right. Absolutely fascinating. Well, you know what's interesting is it sounds like both of you, in your own ways, you've cross-pollinated. You know, which I guess, without wishing to sound self-justifying in any way. Much of what Mark and I and everyone at Space Rocks have, kind of, I guess, for a long time really kind of pushed was the idea that, that the arts and sciences, they're not the opposite ends of a spectrum, but they form a bit of a continuity, that, science answers questions that satisfy our intellect. Art expresses the beauty of the world around us, including outer space as well, which is certainly something that isn't always obvious, but certainly it's almost like a flip sides of a DNA strand to me. They both interact in really deep and important ways. So what's also interesting though is in your work you've discovered science and outer space as well. Kate, it sounds like you had that very early on, and for yourself, yes, say.
Yeah, for me also, I mean, for me, it's very relevant to write about themes that touch on society on the one end, but also I love these inspirations that come from, perplexing, profound epiphanies, that are very much occurring through sciences. And I mean, I could jump straight into the project where we collaborated for that, where, in Remnants of the Past, this is the piece I wrote, one of the pieces I wrote for the WDR Big Band. What this was about, I mean, it came out of a 6-hour-long conversation with Mark at the ESA Space Center in Noordwijk in the Netherlands. We were just meeting there, and we were talking for hours, and in the end we came to this point of discussing how crazy this is that we can look so far into space that we see the past, right? So hence Remnants of the Past, and you see this light and you've experienced the seeing of it now. However, you're actually seeing billions of years into the past. And then we came, I think it was Mark who triggered this idea, like, what if you imagine that you manage to zoom in so clearly that you manage to see a person and you look him straight in the eye, right there in the other end, right? But actually it's so long ago that even though you have the experience that you think you're looking him straight in the eye, the person looking back sees double the time back in time, right? So I mean, he would see or something that occurred here double the amount of time ago. So it's this weird perception of this complexity of time and space that this piece was about, and it's very inspiring to write about such complexity.
Yeah, we had this kind of wacky idea as we were sitting in the canteen in ESTEC was, if you could turn, obviously the speed of light is very fast. So when we look at the sun is 8 minutes away. Effectively, it takes 8 minutes for the light to get from the sun. But if you could turn the speed of light down by a huge factor, then you could look a few meters away and you'd be seeing, let's say, 10 years ago. Or look even further, you see 100 years ago. And if you look, 100 meters away, you're actually seeing back to Roman times. So then not only would you be digging up the Roman road, you'd actually be seeing Romans actively at that distance. And if you look beyond them, you'd see, mammoths roaming around in Europe and that kind. So that kind of idea of being able to see into the past, normally it's so instantaneous we don't think about it. But by artificially turning the speed of light down to a very small number, you could kind of visualize it. So I have this idea, at some point we should get the music and the animation together to do an art piece where you could actually be in virtual reality and actually see Romans and then cavemen and then dinosaurs at certain distances surrounding you on all sides. But we then, of course, we did a cute thing with the orchestra in the WDR Big Band, which was to pretend that the speed of light was slow for them. So when Jesse conducted them, the front row responded first, and then the second row were a second behind, and the third row were another second behind. So you played a piece which was in sync to begin with, and then the second time it was completely out of sync because the speed of light was built in there. And then I insulted everybody in the band by saying it sounded the same both ways because it was jazz. It didn't sound any different. But
yeah, that was an easy score, wasn't it, Mark? That was an easy score.
And then one of the members of the band said, "I don't want him saying that during the live performance. That's insulting to jazz."
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting though. You know, in the context of this call, archaeology has actually come up a few times. You know, I've got a bit of a background myself, as it happens, and you know, I guess it's incredibly disappointing for anyone that grows up watching things like Raiders of the Lost Ark, that a lot of archaeology is really looking at people's garbage. You know, because that's where you learn about them. You know, about their daily habits. It's not through idols or, you know, kind of, you know, bejeweled crowns, but through the things that they leave behind, which is really quite interesting, Kate, because of course you're responsible for, I guess you could say, humanity's true legacy in space, or at least, you know, for a very brief moment. Tell us a little bit about space, John.
Sure. I mean, I'm going to a little disclaimer in that I'm an artist, not a scientist. So I talk from my perspective. Yeah, sort of growing up, like I first encountered the notion of things that are in orbit around Earth as space debris, but also as satellites through. Well, as I visited Dad's station for the first time, he showed me the laser ranging system, and that sort of demonstrated how the lasers are sort of shoot out into the atmosphere and then get reflected back, and that's how you measure how far away a certain object is. And then I've watched as the model has kind of become more detailed over the years. I mean, I think this is like 1995 or 1996 or something where I first saw the station, and it's certainly become much more detailed over the years, and to be able to see in sort of a 3D model where a very large number of these objects stand. And it's quite sort of from my perspective, it's quite sort of shocking to see, because it's just like it sort of looks like an ant's nest or something. Like there's so much stuff, it sort of looks like it's crawling all over the earth, and you can start to see streams where you sort of get like rings, almost like Saturn's rings, that they start to have shape somehow, as so many objects are sort of following the same sort of trajectory, and it's very sort of conflicting experience. I mean, also in my conversations with people who work in this field, because of course a lot of these objects in space are sort of vital for our systems in our current times, of like our telecommunication systems, but also measuring systems, and the way in which we know a lot of things, including the way sort of environments are changing. A lot of sort of climate change research is also due to measurements which are made possible by these objects, and yet you sort of think they're just going up there, they're going out there, and they're sort of like inhabiting our space, and they're going to be there for a very, very long time. We don't know how really we're going to ever get rid of them.
Yeah, well, this is interesting, of course, because I guess this is a great example of the way that the arts can highlight important issues, you know, that affect us, you know, and certainly, well, I guess I suspect that Mark has an opinion on this. You know, I mean, there is a lot of conversation right now about, you know, just like who owns space, who has the right to put things up there that kind of like affect our view of the night sky and all those things. And so I guess there's an important dimension to it all, because it's not just about conveying beauty, but also sometimes illustrating things that are important to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, you know, a very important point there. The irony of protecting the environment by polluting another one, I mean, is not lost on us. And of course, many of these pieces of junk come from earlier in the space age, which that wasn't so much an issue. We know that from the planet Earth as well, that, you know, environmentalism has grown to becoming an incredibly pressing issue, rightly so. Yet much of that stuff, legacy junk, is from a time when people didn't think about that. So there are kind of two halves to that. One is, how do you bring down the legacy stuff? And it's not just that junk is pollution in the sense, but also it's potentially dangerous because you have astronauts in space and that junk impacts the space station. If two satellites hit each other, dead satellites, they create a whole shower of extra junk, which can then kill off everything else slowly. This thing called the Kessler syndrome, where you have a runaway effect. You know, one explosion creates another one. People remember the film Gravity with Sandra Bullock. But you know, so there's a responsibility to bring that material down if we can, but there's also a responsibility when we launch new things, put that mitigation in place. And it's something, you know, it sounds like a sales pitch, but at ESA, we're certainly very interested in that and working on it, beginning to develop satellites which can capture old junk and bring them back down. But of course, this is alluding to the so-called mega constellations, the new sets of constellations from SpaceX and from Blue Origin and other companies, looking to put tens or even ultimately maybe hundreds of thousands of small satellites in space for internet connectivity. And I think they're due to fly overhead tonight, some of them, but fortunately it's got cloudy because every time I see them, they raise my blood pressure unacceptably. I don't know, have you seen any of the Starlink satellites fly overhead?
I had an experience. I don't know what I'm seeing, but I have seen satellites flying overhead. I had this crazy experience where I with a group of people went out as far away from light as possible, specifically to watch the night sky. We went to the north of Holland, near where the Hunebedden are. So that was a sort of another link to our archaeology.
You have to. I'm ignorant. What's that?
The Hunebedden. They're prehistoric stone earthworks from near the German border. Okay. They're large stones that sort of look like the Hunebedden means the giant's bed or something. They look, but they're sort of arranged in this beautiful way, which is sort of like skeletons in the ground made of giant stones. They're really quite incredible. Anyway, but we were watching the stars and we could see very clearly, but then the stars started to move in a very strange way, and then we realized that we weren't looking at stars, we were looking at satellites.
Okay. Yeah, with the Starlink ones, when you see them for the first time, I mean, they get launched in a batch of 60, and then they're in relatively low Earth orbit and in orientation which reflects the sun quite brightly for a number of weeks, maybe months, before they get raised to their final orbits. And when you see them for the first time, you know, it's astonishing because you see 60 coming, one after another, all on the same track. So you see one satellite and then you see another one behind it and another one, and this goes on for 20 minutes or you know, even longer. Quite it's, and I have a strong opinion on it, but I won't, you know, necessarily dwell on that so much. Everybody should go and see it. And I think, again, to inform themselves about what's happening, because this is just 60 out of, you know, maybe 40,000, which will be up there in a few years' time. So I think, how would you, let's switch to Jesse here. How would you see the role of music and art in bringing awareness of those kinds of issues? You know, science can be for good, of course, but science and technology can have a bad side. Have you reflected on that in some of your work that you've done? Because I know you have a project looking forward for next year where, you know, some of that builds in a way.
Yeah, so for me, music has a great function in society of communicating to large groups of people, you know, and it's through very other means. It's through something very connecting, because the music experience itself, you know, coming to hear music, you know, let's call it, you know, a very friendly environment in a way where the audience comes to be part of something, to get an experience, right? So that already opens up the mind in a different way than when you read a newspaper, right? So for me, music is a very important means of you know, communicating something to people. And yeah, with regards to the project coming up, I'm working on this project called Fight for Light, where you know, where many, you know, where I discuss light quite, you know, try to capture light quite literally in musical ways, but also more figuratively, you know, taking it as, you know, light being energy, being strength, being goodness, but also themes like bringing out the color, right? Because light, as it reflects, it basically makes us see color, creating clarity, which you could relate even to the confusion of our times, right? The information chaos that we are living in at the moment, but also a theme like providing warmth, so caring for each other. So in the end, central themes of this are values like respect, inclusiveness, and as I like to put it, colorful diversity, right? And connectivity. So these, for me, a project can embody these themes, and will, of course, once you hear the music, it can mean many things. For every individual can mean something else, right? It has a very pluriform character in the end. And I like that. I don't want to push my meaning in any way. However, there's usually inherent to people coming to a composer's project, there's this interest in, oh, what did the composer think? So that's an opportunity to share something. So I of course try to take those opportunities to discuss these matters and to bring shed light on also when it comes to, for instance, if you collaborate between a composer and ESA, like we did, then this is also an opportunity to talk about this shared message, because of course we have a lot of shared message with regard to this, right? You are also trying to do many of these things in many ways, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that raises the question. I bring it to Kate. So, there are times when I think sometimes we're almost too heavy-handed in the way that we try to communicate, that we have a message. Let me build my building blocks, and you will understand my message because you're suffering from an information deficit. You know enough, or you don't know the thing I'm trying to tell you. And it's important that you know it. But sometimes I think we need to step back, even in the sciences, and just let the awe and the wonder and the curiosity speak for itself. So, I mean, we had a conversation last year, and similar to the one that I had with Jesse about, which led to your work, Magenta Magnetic. And I have to say, I still don't know what it's about, and I mean that with all the best respect, right? Because it's not programmatic. It's an expression of something inside you linked to other things. But how do you feel in the sense about whether there's a responsibility for the artist to have a message and present a message, or as Jesse said, for every member of the audience, there might be a different message.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think like maybe with music in particular, new music composition, this in a way it can be it exists on so many levels. Like, I mean, maybe visual arts is more direct, and like it's sort of like a thing that you get immediately. But with music, you have to live through it. It's a lived through experience. And one of the things that attracts me to this is that you can kind of create environments within that lived experience. Well, Magenta Magnetic is a really good example, and also Space Junk for me. I mean, I work. And every piece that I do is very different, and I can work programmatically, or actually the thing that I'm very interested in respect with these two works and other works that I've made in the past is sort of like actually the idea of modeling. It's sort of like Magenta Magnetic is sort of like a geometric shape that it's very sort of mathematically constructed. And it relates to a series of pieces that I've worked on exploring kind of cadences, the use of sort of well, specifically the 12 notes that we have, and the way that in which they're sort of constructed, thinking about sort of harmony and music theory, but the way in which that can also be interpreted in sort of like, you can make a crystalline structure, not just a crystalline structure, but a crystalline structure that moves. This idea of using music to create a moving form is really fascinating to me.
So why did you call it Magenta Magnetic? I have to ask, because it's a very evocative but curious title for something.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, it's linked to, well, number one, I myself experienced synesthesia with music, I also experience color, and it comes specifically with harmony and the movement of cadences, not necessarily note on note, but like harmony evokes color for me. And this particular structure, I get this very strong sense of this color. But also in music theory and music history, our tone ladders and our music theory comes out of a link between with science, with mathematics and geometry, the idea of music of spheres, for example, which I guess in modern times, as we use 12-tone equal temperaments, and we've gone through the Romantic era, and now we're in the 20th century, where we sort of divorced music theory from some sort of cosmology, that it becomes more of a sort of expressive device. But I'm completely fascinated by that old form of thinking about music in relation to the quadriviums, the arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, or astrology, and music theory, the idea of sort of arithmetic being kind of a sort of linear thing, and geometry being a solid object, and then music being a moving object. I'm fascinated by this. And so, yeah, Magenta Magnetic, kind of, in my mind, I'm thinking about, from a modern perspective, old music theory in relation to harmony of the spheres. That's my thing.
Okay. It's fascinating you say that, because I've been privileged enough over the last few years to meet and spend long evenings with Vangelis, the famous soundtrack composer, who, again, we were talking about film and how music plays an important role. If you think about Chariots of Fire, or you think about Blade Runner, these are films that almost can't exist separate from his music in a way. But he's utterly fascinated by exactly the same topic, and has been spending years writing music and playing music, and he's told us it's not for publication, it's for him, it's for his own sense of internal exploration of the relationship, because I don't think he's a classically trained musician at all. I think he basically came through the rock side and learned how to play keyboards, but he too has become fascinated by this sort of relationship between mathematics and music. And I think, to clue people in, it's unfortunate tonight. I mean, the one thing we haven't managed to do with Uplink yet is kind of bring in music and bring in film and bring in sound with our guests. But if you're kind of, I'll expose myself if I name names, but your contemporary classical words like serialism and minimalism come to mind. Yeah. And just for a second, because I found it fascinating, even within the small domain, which is the Netherlands, there's a sort of, competing schools of how modern music, how contemporary music it works in that sense, because you actually moved from The Hague to Amsterdam, right, in a sense to, be with one school and not with the other. So how does that work in a day-to-day sense? I mean, maybe I shouldn't have said that, maybe, but...
Sure, no, it's really funny, but it's a thing for sure. I guess, well, in a way, like Vangelis, and the further I go, the more personal it becomes, and I don't really care so much about like the so-called schools. It's not really that interesting to me. It's much more about asking the questions, and sort of like, by asking the questions, then you just sort of try to figure it out or find answers, and that always leads on to the next thing, I guess.
So what, I mean, just because we're really fascinated in space rocks, people do science, it's a creative thing in its way. What's your creative process? How do you, I mean, I don't want to ask the trite question of how are you composing music in coronavirus times, because maybe it hasn't changed that much. It's got an external influence. What's your creative process? And I'll ask Jesse the same question in a moment.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, it changes for every piece. Every piece is a completely different thing. But I guess like each piece answers from before. So for example, like last year I was working on these very sort of structured pieces that were sort of, I was trying to make a model of sort of data and try and make that into a sort of an artistic environment that's interesting to listen to as well. And like this thing, I mean, I find it really fascinating, like working with data and trying to make something that's organic and interesting is a big challenge. And having gone through that this year, I'm trying to find the other way of like completely sort of like a blank slate, disregarding anything to do with anything pre-planned. My forms are through composed and free, sort of one note leads onto the next. So I'm interested in where the notes are going to take me. So I go on a journey.
Is that instrumentally, how is that? Is that with the piano? Is it with sounds in your head that you then transcribe into notes? How does that work?
Well, at the moment, it's very much about the musical instruments that it's about responding directly to the musical instruments. So I work on piano and I work on cello, and I sing. They're my three expressions, I guess. Okay. And yeah, each piece I can't do. I don't tend to do all at the same time. It's like if I'm working on a particular piece which fits better on the cello, then I just play the cello, and I'm just like, and I do a lot of like improvising, and it's like it gets so frustrating because like it's very easy to make a melody, but to make a melody that speaks somehow, it takes a long time. I don't know. It's a mysterious process. I can't really describe to you why if I play this melody, it doesn't do anything, and if I play a different melody, then it catches me, and then it like creates an entire piece just from this moment where it's like it just keeps going. So it's like, yeah, you put two seeds in the pot, and one grows and the other one doesn't, and like who knows why. So, yeah. I'm embracing the mystery again after a long time of trying to sort of rationalize the process, I guess.
Yeah. So yes, for you, how? I mean, you're like Kate, you're a multi-instrumentalist. You've got lots and lots of technique at your fingertips. Is it something which you hear in your head and then you put out, or do you improvise and see what comes? I mean, no, this is I'm abusing completely space rocks. I'm just fascinated by how other people, how other people's lives works.
Well, I mean, but it might be fascinatingly connected. Everything, The thing is, well, let me first emphasize to confirm Kate's mystery part. I mean, I totally agree. In the end, the mystery keeps pushing me to write more music. I think, to be honest, because that's the first thing. Where is the urge coming from? Right? There's this inner need to get more, and why, is that an addiction? Is that anyway? Once we're over this point, I think secondly, there's the whole talk you were having already about geometry and mathematics, which to me in my work, what's super important for me and a driving thing is structures. So structures, and then I'm mostly, I guess, at first, mostly speaking about vertical structures. When we speak about vertical, we mean in the same moment, right? So harmonically speaking, where so much is happening and so much is there to discover, because you start off learning maybe simply about what is a major or minor tonality, and then you go on into what is modality. You learn about other kinds of scales, but then you put it all vertical, and then it turns out you can put stuff on top of each other that doesn't necessarily work if you put it in the same range anymore, and then things start to explode into complexity that is like to be honest, to me it's a geometrical wonder. I figure out the tools, but I can't explain it anymore at some point. I figure out, like, wow, there are these crazy orchestration concepts because I have this huge library here of structures, right? I like, oh, and if I put this one, I can do that one, and then this, and then I build up, and then it's like this crazy thing. So I definitely, and I'm driven, I think, here by my fascination for something I don't quite understand in the end, but what I understand is how to use it, how to apply it, but I don't understand why it works and what the natural rules really are, right? Which is where science comes back in, right? It's great. So that's the vertical process, and then you have the whole linear process, which is about time. And there we also are working with structures, and we call that, we are talking about motivic developments and building blocks, let's say, in more melodic sense, which in the end comes down to the same types of questions, like why do you manage to build an arc that works or that breaks, right? I don't know, but for me it's incredibly important to make it work. So yeah, so it's a whole it's a very complex process in the end, where you use a lot of your background, so your knowledge, let's say, right? Your libraries of concepts, ideas, experiences, I might say, and where you led by, as you were asking about the instruments, right? Led by the piano in my case most of the time. But sometimes other mechanics, like currently I'm writing for vibraphone, and then you kind of have to work with 4 fingers to make sure you don't mess it up mechanically, right? So you play on the piano like that, right? So
the technique.
Yeah, that's what everybody does. I mean, I'm a vibraphonist myself, so I could go up and play it on the vibraphone, but of course, generally I'm at the computer with piano, so I go like that, right? So anyway, these kind of things are also driving you, like you're trying to challenge everything, I think. I mean, that's it. I'm also feeling very motivated to always try challenge things, like what are the possibilities and what are those miraculous findings that you're after. You might not even know, right? But something's driving you there. So, well, that's a whole bulk of talk, but this is kind of the process to me.
Okay, cool. Alex.
It's a lot to think about, but what's interesting is we've kind of gone from one dimension to the other, not just how, art and musical composition can reflect important scientific questions and issues, but how science actually influences like the creation of music as well, I guess, which is something that, and it's not to sound dismissive of, other genres, certainly, but I suppose, in actual composition, it's a very different sort of thing, because there is a much more structured approach to, how you put music together, because there's so much else going on.
Right. Yeah. I think what's relevant to realize is that people that dive deep in composition are definitely very involved in trying to figure out almost the science of it, even though they might not do it scientifically, right? But almost the science of it. And then when it comes to styles, I'm very careful, because for instance, if you look at quite pop related music, there are also people quite deeply involved with synthesizers and building those, and that could completely link to spectralism or something, which is a very advanced musical field, So I mean, it's very interesting actually in the end how styles don't quite matter, in my opinion. It's more about the intensity or not intensity of how deep are you willing to go. And that's to me very interesting when people go very deep. It's kind of a preference personally, and I don't think it's a necessity for all music, but it's just that's just me.
Do you ever get to the point where, I mean, I'm sort of, I don't know why it struck me this way, but there occasionally there's a thing I call cosmic vertigo, where there are moments when the way the universe is, I study it, I work on it, we send satellites out to space, to remote locations, to comets, to planets. We use telescopes to observe black holes and young stars being born. And I don't want to understand that. I mean, it can be quite prosaic sometimes. I mean, it's kind of a job. It's a thing. If I point the telescope here, I can see this, I can measure this, I can infer from that. This is a process that's going on. But there are occasions when my brain just completely lose it and suddenly find myself embedded in a much vaster, the real universe, if you like, rather than my tightly constructed one, which is the thing I'm doing today.
Yeah.
And I suddenly feel like I'm actually sort of flying over the edge of a vast void. And I'm just wondering, artistically, when you engage with the universe, either on the micro scale or the macro scale, does it occasionally get so daunting that how can I, one person, represent this? Or is it just sort of, again, is it a process you just get in the loop of?
Yeah, and it's great that it's about the universe, the same as with music, right? The music, music is also this universe that it can just overwhelm you how little you know and how little you understand, and how much you're just in the middle of it and trying to trying to just highlight little points in the universe in that sense, you know. So it's I think very similar as a feeling. And
Yeah.
you know, these moments where you are struck by something, these epiphany type moments, I think they are you know, probably part of the reason why personally at least I do it, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you, Kate? Is that something where occasionally you kind of, you know, you're lifted out of the moment and you suddenly, I hesitate to call it spiritual, or you know, you use the word epiphany there, yes, but is it something where there's that moment where it all works and then there's a sense of it opening up?
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with Jesse that that's probably the thing that keeps on going. It's a bit of an addiction of like, where's the next thing gonna happen? Like, I want it now. I want to be taken there. Yeah, maybe it is sort of like it's a spiritual thing, or like being taken out into the universe or something. Like it is a sort of mode of travel in a way. Like you go travel into this shape. Which, yeah, I mean, you talk about sort of like being like of seeing black holes, and in a way, like with music, you can also sort of create these shapes. You can go there too somehow. And it's a totally exploratory for sure, and it's always the master. There's always more to know, and everything you do is just a tiny little bit of that. It's just a really and like there are infinite possibilities, and it's amazing that you can have infinite possibilities, yet at some point you can make things work. I don't, yeah.
So I'm curious because, you know, again, you're a contemporary classical musician. My wife grew up in an opera family. Her father was an opera director. We have long discussions about music, and one of the things I've been doing in the lockdown is I can't play a thing. I've never learned to play an instrument at all, but I've got the Moog synthesizer, the Model D, the original kind of, you know, the Ur synthesizer from the 1970s, I suppose. It's available an app on the phone, and it's brilliant. You can just play anything, and I can't play any, but I just explore sounds. And my wife says she hates it. She says that's not music, and it's like, no, it's sound. There's no music because I can't play music. Contemporary classical, I mean, you know, she would say to some extent that it's kind of lost. It's more music about musicians now than it's for an audience, right? The late Romantics, Mahler, Rachmaninoff. I mean, has music lost its way? I personally don't think so. I'm asking as a devil's advocate question. Our audience is still going to keep coming to listen to classical, the way that art kind of lost being representative and became Jackson Pollock, right?
Oh. Right. Well, I'm a big fan of Jackson Pollock. So
well, don't get me wrong. I'm all with this, but I'm kind of speaking for the other side of the argument.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. No, I don't think music's lost it. I think perhaps there have been kind of dogmatic personalities in the music world post, I don't know, I would say 60s and 70s, but before that as well, and up until recently, where it's sort of like became very much about, it's a sort of an iconoclasm, I guess, or sort of like a rebellion against the Romantic era, due to traumatic periods, I think, which also had to do with sort of music has because it's so powerful. I think it has the power to kind of connect itself to certain politics, certain policies, certain ways of sort of manipulating large numbers of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is quite dangerous. And I think, like, yeah, that's very much been under the focus in this last 75 years or so of like, what is music? What does it mean? And how do we sort of, how do we justify what we do in these times? And I would sort of put it like, yeah, maybe it can be compared to an iconoclasm or sort of a Bale-storm in a way, and where like the old values were sort of disregarded, and with that a lot of the things that we kind of connect with music as well, which is sort of like a cultural heritage, sort of collective memory, something that connects to something which is spiritual, maybe something that's not just about us but about all of us together in relation to nature and the universe, and I guess in a way, like I don't know what you say, Yessi, but for our generation, we sort of come after all of this, and we sort of having, and we come at a sort of like it's after the wave in a way where actually maybe we're the first generation to really come to terms with the possibility that we have no idea what our grandparents, how they operated, or like we don't have that sort of like collective memory or community or sort of like cultural heritage. It's sort of like, and I mean, the thing, like what I'm really going deep into at the moment is, as I think about the environment, I also think about which environments. And me being connected to Australia, that's a very poignant question, because if I think about, if I identify as an Australian, then my environment that I would like to be able to communicate would be the Australian landscape and the Australian bush, for example. But then as a sort of person of colonial heritage, I'm confronted with Aboriginal heritage and the sort of Aboriginal cosmology, tradition, cultural heritage, and Aboriginal people who are of my generation face the same thing as I also feel, that they feel lost because in a way their cultural heritage, memory, collected, and the stories, which is connected to their environment, has sort of been taken away from them, and now they have nothing. And I think that's an extreme case, and I think for our generation we deal with this in quite a strong way.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in there if you don't mind, because I totally agree that, you know, with you know, our you know, the generation that were making music, you know, post-war, let's say, or during or post-war, they had a message that was so related to those events. And for me, I always struggle to quite comprehend why they speak such painful music, you know. And when I go a little bit back, then I'm struck by how beautiful some, you know, and how greatly some things reach me from the 20s, for instance. So then I found some composers also in the Netherlands, like Van Gilze or Vermeulen or Ton de Leeuw, or, you know, there are composers from the, you know, well, actually Ton de Leeuw is later, but it's interesting that some people were you know, clearly loving and celebrating romantic music still, even though they were moving on with it, right? And impressionism, and maybe, you know, influences of all over the place, like Stravinsky. And I think for current composers, like myself, I mean, I don't know, it's hard to also always look at yourself, because for, you know, for me, for instance, I have this problem. I wouldn't dare call myself either a jazz or a classical musician, because it just doesn't work for me, this division. So you know, who am I, where am I coming from? It's a very mixed field already, you know. But for me, the influences that speak to me, there is still this huge celebration of beauty, you know. And it's a thing that was not accepted for in arts, including music, for a period of time. And you know, I think that's where, yeah, it's a sort of pity to have to call it out like that, to call something like aesthetics the pivot point where you lose people, you know. But I think it remains important that people always name that, you know, whether you want to fight that or not. Sorry, but it's something that people mention, isn't it?
But I think, you know, as Kate points out, right, quite rightly, you can't be innocent of the post-war era and the way that people rebelled. So do you think that music will maybe drift? I'm not even sure directions matter. It will always change. But you know, the worst thing that could happen, right, is that marching bands and great triumphal music becomes popular again as populism arises, right? We can't be naive about the way that politics plays a role. So even if we return to aesthetics and to beauty, we live in a world which is not very beautiful in other ways, right? So how to focus on those two things together? I mean, it's a responsibility on all of us as citizens, but as artists, even more potentially in a way.
Right. Yeah, I would like to point out that I think, though, even though we are, I mean, personally, I feel very drawn to bring beauty in my music. I do, however, also bring lots of colors that came from lots of more dissonant searches of composers. It's not, you know, beauty, it doesn't mean that you're not including dissonance. So there is this level of evolution, let's say, in what beauty might be, you know. So I still think, you know, things that I consider beautiful currently, as a child I may not have. So there's already an evolution in myself, right? So yeah, so in the end, you also, and I think that's also very interesting, because that means as a composer, you might lose your public in the long run, because maybe you're just going a bit far. So,
yeah. I think there are many rock bands have gone in that direction over the years.
I was about to say, Mark and I are both a bit of you could say, prog music fans. So yeah, we're very accustomed to artists going on journeys, sometimes places that you don't necessarily want to go. Well, you know, the time is flying, and I mean, speaking of journeys, I just want to bring in some of the people who've very patiently been watching us tonight, joining us on YouTube. You know, I mean, a tremendous question about a kind of journey. I mean, one originally begun and I guess asked in the years running up to 1977. Charlotte asks, if you had to send one piece of music out into outer space to other civilizations, I suppose, assuming that they hear things the way that we do, of course, what piece of music would you choose and why? Okay. I know it's a big one. You might take a moment to reflect.
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, I mean, there are so many pieces that are treasures. Could say Beethoven symphony or Mozart or Stravinsky, like. But to be honest, like from my personal perspective, that the piece that sort of touched me early on and still remains a gem is Arvo Pärt's Fratres for cello octet. This piece is a real gem as far as I'm concerned.
Beautiful, beautiful. I actually seen it played with Arvo Pärt in the audience in Berlin once, and yeah, amazing piece. Yeah, everybody go and get it. We do this. We do recommendations in Space Rocks. It's perfectly legitimate that we name things and tell people to go and listen to it or watch it straight away.
I think we'll follow this up with a link to that piece as well. You say.
So now it's up to me, right? Well, I find this an incredibly hard question, you know, but you know what the funny part is? It triggers a question in me, like, why do we send out music anyway? So I'm like, okay, I want to have peace, okay? So for me, I would link the message to making sure it's a peaceful piece of music, you know? So it's something that really celebrates a certain yeah, the thing is, it can then go many directions still, right? It can be simply a beautiful, warm theme, or it can be a certain childlike emotion even. I'm really quite lost what to pick, to be honest. Maybe Clarinet Concerto of Mozart would be great. It could be a great choice. But another more recent choice that, you know, slightly more recent, would be, for instance, the second movement of Ravel's Piano Concerto in G. It would be also this, I mean, I think it's more of an embracing kind of thing, and it goes a little further. So in the end, I might go for Mozart after all. You know, I don't know. It's difficult.
That's good. It's good that we have two options there.
Kind of motivation for Alex's question, I mentioned 1977, of course, is the famous golden record that was put together and put on the Voyager probes that are now in interstellar space, both of them. And this was put together by Carl Sagan and a number of other people, Andrew and his wife. And it drew together on, you know, a very short time period. What could you put on an LP? It was LP shaped, but it was not, you know, you couldn't put it on a record player. And there were some very classical pieces like Mozart and Beethoven on there. And there were voices of children from around the world. But I was involved in a project last year, and I'd love to get you two connected to a guy called Stuart Acker Holt. He's a documentary maker, British, but lives in Amsterdam. And he had a film called For the Record, which asks contemporary musicians, mostly, as it turns out, in a kind of electronic domain, but Philip Glass is in the film as well, about, you know, how would you curate a new golden record? What would you do today? What if you had a bit more time? What, you know, and what's remarkable about the film is exactly the same as you two. It's like, wow, I have no idea. Wow, what a question, right? Because there's so much. But the idea is, you know, is there? How would you curate such a thing? And my thought, talking to Stuart, was that instead of sending it into interstellar space as kind of an emissary, which may never get picked up, perhaps we should actually leave it here somewhere in the outer solar system as a remnant when we're gone, that people would come and maybe, because you're more likely to go to a star and find its planets than you find an empty piece of junk in outer space, right?
Yeah.
So I would end up probably choosing lots of radiums and sticking them on there, right? And yeah, there were humans here once, but
there's also this striking problem about it, where, you know, okay, so we are both mentioning two very Western pieces of music. I mean, that's also bugging me. Like, okay, and then you know, I cannot judge all music on this planet even, you know, so how can we even judge how it would be received on the other end, right? So very interesting problem. And then you know, and then on the other hand, I wanted, since I'm also slightly representing the jazz side of things, I was thinking we could also send out something like Summertime, you know, of course, which is not necessarily a jazz piece, right? It's actually, you know, maybe we should send it out sung by Golda Schultz, you know, the opera singer, who does a great job, phenomenal. And then it's of course more the opera version of the piece. So I mean, but again, you know, what about, for instance, you were talking about the Aborigine culture. What would they feel as peaceful? You know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, I was I would probably say, I was thinking about that too, but considering everything, I would probably bring in interspecies music. I would put some whales on there very likely, and some solitary bees.
There's this, I don't know, you've probably heard it, the symphony by Alan Hovhaness, and God created, was it God created great whales? And you know, you play that, it's a classical piece from the 20th century, and then, you know, pretty shortly on, there's whales all the way through it. And again, my wife, I played it to her recently, and she said, "Is there something wrong with the stereo?" It's like, no, those are whales. It's fine. It's a beautiful piece. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really fortunate to live next to the zoo, and one of the things which has been a sort of an epiphany or revelation since the pandemic has taken hold is that as there are not so many planes and the traffic is greatly reduced, so suddenly I can hear all these different animals which I didn't hear before. Before I can hear the gibbons really clearly, like they at 8 o'clock in the morning, almost exact. We hear the gibbon songs, but now it's amazing. Every day I hear something new, and I sort of try to figure out which animal it is. The first one to sort of emerge was the wolves. I think they're wolves. That intermittently throughout the day I get this the howling, like the whoo.
I'm looking forward to being reflected in your music. That's got to happen.
People keep saying, yeah.
a slightly more complicated duet, but you know, we'll keep our eyes peeled, certainly. Well, I've got to say, guys, it has been such an absolute pleasure to have you on Space Rocks Uplink, and I hope it's just the beginning of you know, many interactions and collaborations. You know, because it feels like we're speaking the same language, and we're so appreciative of your spending the time with us, and to everyone who watched tonight as well. Mark, anything else?
Yeah, well, we, of course, so you were at Space Rocks in London last year. Kate, you'll need to come to one of the live events when we get going again, because of course that's something which is a big deal for all the musicians that we know and we're working with every day, is, you know, when do we transition back to live music? And you guys can sit at home and compose, but there's a point at which you need to perform as well. And I know that that's a frustration for everybody, but on the other hand, we have to take it easy and stay safe. And I kind of hope that live events don't happen too soon for the reasons, if you know what I mean. But yeah, the thing that we do right at the end, we almost got there when you were talking about the vibraphone and how you compose with the vibraphone. Yes, earlier on with your four fingers.
It's a bit like that.
Yeah, it's a little bit like that. So in Space Rocks, we like to finish with our space, and I can't even do it now. It is the Vulcan salute, and Rocks is this one. So if we do that, So,
Very well done. Very well done.
so thank you very much, guys, for coming on, and I really look forward to seeing you in person again soon. But thank you very much for coming tonight.
Guys,
Thank
thank
for
you
having
very
us.
much for your
It
time.
was really fun.
You well.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Okay.
everyone.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Everybody.
Bye bye.